So let me start off with the first presentation. This is very much a scene setter, and I'm going to what we will tend to do is to give you physical copies of this material, because people like to take notes. But we'll also give you an electronic copy of all this at the end of the session, if you would like to pass those around. And David and I are going to set the scene. And Darius at the back is going to be very annoyed with me if I walk around too much, but I can't stand still for too long, so I hope he'll bear with me. Because really, I've been working in retail for 30 years, and it's always a bit of a truism to say, well, of course, we have so much change in retailing. But actually, the last 5 years, I think I've probably seen more change than the previous 25 put together in terms of many markets that we're dealing with. To the extent that we're kind of looking at a new retail landscape emerging, not just within the Western world, within mature Western markets, but increasingly internationally, as we look at markets like India and China and Southeast Asia and Latin America in particular. I wanted to paint a picture over the next half an hour or so before passing on to David of some of the issues that I think we as organisations face, and I'd like your thoughts really on the extent to which in each of your countries, each of your sectors, you're affected by some of these kinds of questions. I was at the World Retail Congress in Rome in September last year, and that brings together around about 1,500 retail CEOs and directors from around the world. And listening to the plenary sessions and the discussions in the room, bars and so on. And here were the kind of the headlines that we were seeing around uncertainty, around growth in certain markets, around cost cutting, around not sure what is in store, turnarounds, Tesco for example. But the kind of phrases that I was hearing were really quite alarming phrases in respect of certainly existing businesses, perhaps interesting for new entrants to the market, but certainly unsettling. So we hear, not just unprecedented change, but of course the economic fluctuations that are facing us in particular markets. We hear about the omni-consumer, and John Lewis Partnership, as you know, is one of our leading department store retailers here in the UK. They finally bitten the bullet on our opening in Oxford next year, what they call their first omni-store. And we're all waiting with bated breath to see what that looks like. Whether it has kind of flashing lights and neon over the top, I'm not quite sure. But knowing John Lewis, it'll be very subdued. But the notion that there can be something called an omni-store is a really interesting semantic issue, if not anything else. But we also heard last year, the notion that e-commerce was not always our friend. That certainly for existing legacy businesses, e-commerce was a destroyer of value. And was destroying value in ways that couldn't have been thought of a few years back. So for example, price comparison services. Even Amazon is now affected by the proliferation of online price comparison services that track and scrape websites in real time. So you can track the way a price is changing in real time and set a reserve price and say, well, I won't buy it until it gets below this certain level. So all that value above the line, if you like, is being destroyed, because no one is willing to make that purchase other than someone who is ignorant of the price level until it gets below your reserve price. So e-commerce in conventional ways, by simply getting at the customer before we can as conventional store-based businesses, and new kinds of businesses creating demand and siphoning off that demand to their own pockets, is meaning that many traditional structures and business models in retailing are becoming less sustainable. I'll talk a bit about that. We heard about brave new startups. There was a 15-year-old lad presenting about his new e-commerce startup on the platform to 1,500 CEOs. And it's always interesting listening to CEOs talking about e-commerce or social media and just waiting for how long it will take them before they introduce their children into the conversation. Yeah? So rather than use kind of rigorous consumer research and careful methodology, there's always, oh well, of course, yeah, my daughter does this, and therefore, as a business, we must do the following. So this says something about the kind of the generational effects of some of these sorts of forces, and that frankly, again, senior leaders of organisations may not be best equipped to deal with some of these kinds of challenges. So the leadership challenges of this transformation are equally important, though they're not ones that I'll discuss in detail today. We've heard about, of course, digital immigrants and digital natives. My son is a digital native. Take broadband internet away from him and it's like someone has taken the oxygen out of the room and he's kind of dying. For digital immigrants, these majority of leaders of retail organisations who are seeking to come to terms with the challenge that's presented by e-commerce and by non-store trading. We also, certainly in certain markets, have issues around sustainability of the retail offer. If we're proliferating channels to market, whether it's mobile, to home, to click and collect points, to distribution centres, to stores, all these little white vans driving around with physical goods, what are the sustainability dimensions of apparently more efficient online retailing? But also, what's the sustainability in financial terms? So, the challenge of building and maintaining sustainable margins as an omni-channel business is a significant one today for most firms. And as I say, that kind of requires retail leadership, which itself is somewhat transformational. There's much discussion in Rome last September about what were the particular skill set that was required to lead an organisation of that new kind into the next 10 to 20 years. So where does locational planning research fit into this? You might be forgiven for saying that actually perhaps a programme like this should pack its bags and go home, because we haven't got to worry anymore about location planning for stores, because we can simply let the market decide where demand is and how we'll meet that demand. I have to say, I think, rather like Mark Twain said, the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, because as David will go on to describe later on in this session, there are probably more ways in which techniques and approaches and models and frameworks that we use on a day-to-day basis can be brought into the service of an omni-channel business than simply a store-based business. And we'll talk a bit about that later on this morning, but also throughout the workshop. And of course the answer is, it's horses for courses. It depends where you are, what geography you're in, the extent to which the market is challenged by non-store activities, and by particularly market and literate consumers, for example, and shoppers. So if you look, for example, at a market like Finland, although Finland is a very technologically literate market, in fact the penetration of e-commerce is by no means as substantial as it is in the UK or the US, simply because the market is very small and it's dominated by 2 or 3 very big players who in effect have kind of almost declared a truce between themselves. So, well, we won't kind of rock the boat. Now there is a bit of movement going on in this area, but what it's meant is that probably that market is not as well developed as it could be. And one of the reasons is that certainly if you're a Finnish retailer offering home delivery to remote parts of a very widely dispersed country, is actually very, very expensive. So there's some significant cost barriers to doing this kind of thing in some markets. So it depends where you are. It depends what retail business you're in. And around the table we've got a wide range of businesses that are going to be very differently affected by some of these kinds of shifts. So we'll see some high growth markets, not all markets that are around the table here, but certainly markets like Iran, like China, Middle East, where we're seeing still some substantial growth in physical real estate. And some very successful, after early poor start, of mall development in China, in Malaysia, for example, Indonesia, very strong Asian markets. And I'm off to Dubai for the next retail congress in a couple of weeks, and although the Middle East is having a bit of a crisis at the moment, not just geopolitically, but in terms of oil prices, the Saudi government is cost cutting, but the UAE is doing pretty well, as is Qatar in terms of its economy, and retailing and leisure there is doing extraordinarily well, with some really globally preeminent physical retail space being created in those kinds of locations. But we can also see, in the UK and US and Australia, there are some developments, physical developments that are expanding. About Games Workshop, the kinds of formats and operations that are growing there, compared, let's say, with some of the shrinking of grocery real estate in some markets, of apparel and clothing in other markets. So we tracked, for example, the decline in multiple clothing retailers in the UK, something like a 5% fall in outlets over a 2-year period. There's a real volatility and a real change sector by sector here as well. And there are many examples, of businesses that are physically growing. I mean, Aldi and discounters generally extraordinarily successful and still growing very, very strongly in many markets. H&M, again, discounter clothing. IKEA experimented with new formats and again still growing internationally to quite an extent. A business like Primark, again. I don't know how Primark is being received on the East Coast. Todd, do you
I haven't heard.
You haven't heard yet?
We were looking at a spot where they were also involved.
Yeah. So they're quite, if you have a chance to go to the Oxford store, is just being closed for a rebuilding exercise on the shopping mall here. But the store they're in is much smaller. But actually, it's an extraordinarily busy store, overtrades phenomenally in Oxford and indeed elsewhere. Well, it was very big. It was something in the order of, department store size, so it's kind of getting on for 35,000, 40,000 square foot. But they had to move to a smaller location, which is about less than half that size. But everyone's like this now. But again, where else would you find people tolerating massive queues to pay for apparel in a physical store? And Primark experimented with online trading with ASOS, the online clothing retailer. Did it for 6 months, decided not to go ahead with it. So there are some retailers that are quite happy to focus on physical formats continuously. So we should not generalize about the particular opportunities that are available for particular kinds of firms. What we are seeing in physical spaces, though, and I'd be interested in your observations from your different geographical markets, is what I call servicisation. It says, the number of centres and downtowns where you see service outlets taking the place of conventional retailers. We've got, I think this is your figure, David, isn't it? US shopping centre occupancy about 94%.
Yes, that's what ICSC claims.
Yeah, okay, that's what they claim. No,
yes.
You haven't actually gone around and check it, right? Always check your data on this. But I mean, that's not all retailers. That's service and leisure outlets.
That's
as well.
Everything,
Yeah.
and a lot of centres are being rescued by one service activity after another, whether it's dry cleaning, nail salons, doctors, dentists, and so on.
Yeah.
Well, that seems high. That seems high to me.
Yeah.
It does to me, I must admit. I'm short of going around and checking it myself. I don't know.
I go around town and give you 10
Yeah.
vacancies.
Yeah.
It varies regionally.
Yeah.
For example, the other week I was on Long Island, which is densely populated. It's an island. It's rather like the UK. Very, very high occupancy rates. But then you go in many areas of the Midwest and you see centres that are completely dark.
Yeah. But it's also true to say that the density of US retail space is significantly lower. There is more space per capita in the US than almost anywhere else in the world.
Yes.
Partly because of the easy regulation and the low cost of sites. So you would expect that figure to be a bit lower because there's so much spare space around. In a sense.
Too much was developed in the old days.
Yeah.
Pre.
So does this also reflect the kind of closure as well? So stuff has been actually closed down, so it doesn't come in the figures in effect.
That's one of the many questions about the 94% figure.
So what we can say though is that traditional store location research is becoming less important for many retailers that are thinking about their multi-channel or omni-channel developments. But we also need to think about how those techniques can be leveraged in a variety of channels. So whilst certain commodity retailers are particularly affected by online retailing, there are others that aren't. Here's another example. This is Box Park in East London. This is a pop-up shopping centre, which is made out of shipping containers. It's here for 4 years, and every 6 months the tenants change in each of these containers. So it creates a real buzz, a real excitement about the place. And creating an attractive environment is part of that store appeal, which is hard to quantify in a forecast. It's the kind of non-price factor that you put into the exercise. So what I want to do in about half an hour or so really is to talk a bit about the context for location planning research. What I've called adjusting to the new normal. What's kind of happening in the financials and the arithmetic of the business model in retailing, particularly in terms of the legacy physical infrastructure and how cost pressures are accommodated. And then David's going to pick up for the remainder of the session in thinking about the future for retail location research And he's thinking particularly about the various applications and themes that he's observed firms around the world engaging in, which are again a mixture of store-based and non-store-based applications and activities. And we'll go through those with some examples as we get later on into the morning. But you can see the kinds of challenges. This is just some UK stuff that I picked out. There's a US mall there, but so a lot of refurbishment going on in shopping malls in the UK. We've got a lot of retreat, so Tesco towns counting the cost of a retail empire in retreat as the land bank is closed down and as there is retreat from store development for that particular retailer. The growth of new kinds of distribution mechanisms like click and collect, and of course the threat of new entrants. So not just Amazon leasing warehousing in prime locations in London, but also the recently announced collaboration between Amazon and Morrisons to roll home delivery of food out. And again, kind of Morrisons jumping over existing incumbents to do quite an interesting and creative deal rather than build the capacity themselves from scratch organically. So let's think a bit about the economic growth, first of all. And it isn't just, of course, about the growth of online retailing. It's about the exaggeration of that through low levels of economic growth. So what growth there is to be had, in some senses, is being creamed off through non-store growth increasingly at perhaps margins which are not as sustainable as we would like them to be. And that weak economic recovery, the concerns we have about even in emerging markets like China and other markets in Southeast Asia, Japan, for example, and the memory, the race memory almost of shoppers, certainly here in the UK, having learned to be frugal, having learned to be cautious with their spending. And certainly if we, Almar, if we would have been here 10, 11 years ago, we'd have been saying, well, of course, Aldi won't succeed in this country because UK consumers don't want to be seen in an Aldi store. They're far too kind of snobbish to be seen in an Aldi store. If you go to Germany, then you'd see BMWs parked outside Aldi and everyone is happy going in and shopping and so on. But for some reason in the UK, there was this kind of class war thing about discount retailers, which of course was played up by the major food retailers at the time, saying, well, you don't need to go to Aldi because we're the biggest discounters in town. There's a sort of argument. Yeah.
In the Netherlands, especially Lidl achieved that.
Yes.
Everyone goes to Lidl.
Yeah.
No one
No one goes to the mainstream.
they don't care anymore.
They don't care, exactly. So they don't care about whether. Indeed, it's become in the UK. I don't know. It's like the Netherlands. It's become something of a talking point at a dinner party for middle-class households, who say, I got this wonderful prosecco from Aldi. A savvy shopper kind of thing. I only paid £9 for it. In fact, it was probably £7.99 in Tesco. But the fact they were in Aldi at the time meant it was a good deal.
Jonathan, one question concerning the approach of Aldi. For example, what did Aldi do to change the mindset of the UK guys?
Well, two things happened. One was Aldi and one was the market. So the consumer had a lot of economic pressure. It was no longer kind of fashionable to be seen shopping in stores that were notably higher priced than others. So people were shopping around and some had to shop around, some were much more frugal as a result. Aldi themselves, though, had got themselves into a corner about 8 or 9 years ago. They'd actually gone a bit upmarket in the UK to try and compete with some of the competitors in that area. And in fact, they sacked the team and brought in a guy from Austria to run Aldi UK along much more traditional lines. The challenge for Aldi in the UK, again, always was getting sites. And of course, as the market got slightly more relaxed, because not many people were developing, so there was an acceptance amongst local planning authorities that an Aldi store would be acceptable in that area. So there's a series of factors, I think, on the consumer side, on the management side and positioning side, and on the physical store side. And that combination, together with, I suppose, the exposure of major food retailers as being a little overpriced
Lidl, in the Netherlands, Lidl is not really a discounter anymore. It's
Yeah.
more mid-market.
Really
Yeah,
interesting.
they-
Yeah,
they-
yeah. Because Aldi tried that about 8 or 9 years ago and got caught out quite badly.
yeah,
They had a store in Manchester, I think, a sort of city centre store in Manchester, that you could have thought was a Marks and Spencer store at one point. It was so beautifully kind of appointed. You think, well, you walk in there and you say, well, actually, that's going on the prices, isn't it? You know? Of course, you now walk into an Aldi here in Oxford, and it's as basic as you can get still.
Do you know how they're doing in the US?
Yes. We've just finished an in-depth research study on Aldi in the US, and many of the same effects as in the UK have happened in the US. And let's not forget that the average American income is now, in real terms, 5% less than it was in 2007. And this is reflected in presidential politics at the moment. People are highly involved in a deflationary mentality. They have to cut the costs of groceries or of living because incomes are going nowhere or have not been going anywhere. And that's increased the appeal of Aldi. At the same time, as Jonathan said, Aldi's private brand program, which is 90%, has very high standards, and people have slowly but surely realized they're getting good value on these private brands that are not advertised. And the national brands in the States are really suffering, as you probably are well aware from all the
Yeah, we had a similar situation where they were in the lower income areas and they were pretty ugly looking stores, and when they started creeping out into the other suburbs, people were at first were like, what is this? Like, no.
Yeah.
But then one thing I noticed, they improved the look of them from the outside to fit some of these areas, and then all
And
these other
inside.
economic things, yeah. And then all the other things happen
Yeah.
economically that help too.
Yeah.
But
I mean, yeah, economically, it's absolutely where the story starts in a sense, because you've got low growth, but you've also got low inflation. So it's very hard to increase prices. It's very obvious if your prices are above those of your competitors, because the volatility reduces in price changes as well, particularly in food retailing. So, I mean, if you look at growth internationally, and what I've got here is Western markets. So I've got the US, UK, Nordic markets, Germany, France, and you can see that actually, historically, the last 3-4 years, the US has been about 2.2% per annum consumer expenditure growth. The UK about 1.9%, Nordic markets 1.3%, Germany 0.8%. France actually in decline. So the next 10 years, the forecast is, assuming China doesn't blow up and the whole place kind of collapses around us, and that's a big assumption to make. It's not going to be much better. About 2% is the best we can do. In fact, the UK will be about 2.2% a year over the next 10 years. And China is kind of lamenting the fact that its growth rate has reduced from about 11% to 6.5%. It'd be nice to have 6.5%, actually, I must admit. But of course, with that kind of growth rate, you have a buoyant business opportunity. And if inflation is slightly higher, you have much more room to play with in terms of the way in which the business can develop. In a low growth market, low inflation market, in some food instances, a negative inflation market, you've got very, very limited room for maneuver. Add online to that, and the pressure becomes intolerable in many cases.
I was in the US recently, and it felt like in the grocery market we're almost seeing more polarization. So people were either aiming for like a Whole Foods, very upmarket kind of vibe, or they were appealing to the wallet.
yes, some of the supermarkets do both within the same store.
Yeah.
I'd say Mariano's is in that a little bit, where
Yeah.
you can go for your ketchup, the regular old Heinz ketchup, but then there's also this other side where they're making the food for you right there, and there's the sushi bar, just different sides of the store.
And that's reflected also in kind of not just more frugal shoppers, this is UK data, but more promiscuous, in other words, shopping around and buying what they need in different places rather than a one-stop shop. So this graph simply shows more frequent shopping, if you like. So the proportion of UK customers shopping 3 or more times a week for food and groceries has gone up from about a third to about a half in the space of 4 years. People are shopping around more. They're using a bigger range of channels. So they're using mobile to do price comparisons. increasingly, 42% saying they're doing that. But this is the figure that the orange bars here are the things that show this. So this is using more now than I did 12 months ago. And that's pretty nearly every channel. The ones that show the slowest growth are in traditional supermarkets and hypermarkets and the baker shop for some reason. But the biggest growth is around discount supermarkets, online from a supermarket, online any grocery retailer, farm shops, butcher shops, convenience stores. All those channels have seen greater patronage, but not necessarily, big volume increases. It's sharing that smaller, that kind of small growing cake out amongst a wider group of channels. So shoppers, many shoppers, not everybody, shoppers willing to put more time in, if you like, to get the goods that they want to have. And that's before we get to online. And here's the kind of online context. What I've got here is some estimates that exclude things like ticketing and entertainment products and travel. This just shows the total internet sales for products by country last year. The US has about a third of total sales, but China has a fifth already of total sales online. UK is third of the major countries, so UK has about 8% of all the world's internet sales going on there. What becomes more interesting, though, is when you look at sales per capita. So again, the extent to which particular countries are highly penetrated in terms of online sales as against store-based sales. And what I've done here is to take data from Euromonitor, which is a standardized kind of source because they do this on an annual basis. This is the data of 2015, and it looks at spend per capita, so spend per head for 2015. This is in euros, I'm afraid, so you need to do a bit of conversion. Those of you that are not in euro currencies, we never managed to join and just look as though we're going to, I'm afraid. So, UK is leading the game here. So we have 730, actually, I'm sorry, so the key says it's euros. It is actually pounds because I updated it last week and into the latest data. So I took the chance to convert to pounds. So it is actually pound sterling. Okay, so ignore that key there. So it's £730 per head per year in 2015. Compare that to, let's say, the US, which is around about 557, Netherlands 350, Ireland 433, Germany 323. So there are some big differences, despite the fact that actually online penetration is not so different in those markets. So there's something going on in the UK which means perhaps that UK consumers tend to spend more online. Any thoughts what that might be?
I know in the Netherlands we have the store density is very high.
Yes.
How you call it.
Yep.
So that's probably one of the reasons we don't spend as much as, for example, in the UK.
Yep. Yep.
That
And
could be one of
absolutely, yeah. And I guess also in the US you've got high densities, but actually you've got a bigger country. But so there's something similar in some markets in the US there. But any other thoughts about the UK?
Do you think the offer is better because we're so much more densely kind of packed in?
But so is the Netherlands in a sense. So the Netherlands is the same though, isn't it? So why is the UK different from the Netherlands? The geography is not dissimilar in terms of the urbanity of the population, and okay, you've got Scotland, but Netherlands hasn't got anything quite so kind of rural. But many of the densities in Amsterdam and Rotterdam and so on are similar to.
The average customer in the Netherlands only has to travel less than a kilometer for any supermarket.
Yeah.
Average of about 90%, is it?
Yeah.
I think broadband is cheap here. Well, I know it's cheap,
Yeah.
so I pay it in both countries.
It's cheaper than Belgium, interestingly.
compared
Belgium
to
is
US.
$3.19, and one factor I do know is that Belgian consumers have a real problem with broadband costs because the telecoms people. You don't, do you?
Is it a convenience thing? Because in the UK, I mean, I can't imagine having a car here just walking around.
Well, if you tried taking a car into Oxford,
Exactly. US, we've got 900 parking spots.
Yeah.
Whatever.
I mean, Kirsty, you had a problem getting from the Tesco on the ring road to here, which is about 2 miles. It took you how long?
It took more than twice as long
Yeah.
as it should have.
Yes.
So I wonder.
So you can keep rushing.
Yeah. So congestion, rather accessibility.
Accessibility.
Yeah,
I guess.
is one possible explanation.
And I think the real problem, Jonathan, is in the town centres.
Yeah.
And it's not just parking charges, it's parking difficulty, it's traffic wardens that love to harass customers and destroy their own economic base than their own jobs.
So you got a parking ticket last week, did you?
No, I almost
Feeling
got one
bitter about
strapped
something.
again.
Well, let me cut to the chase and give you my kind of explanation of it, which is down here. And as ever, being an academic, it's a lot of things. Okay, not just one explanation for it. If we look at the actual numbers using the same source, UK online sales were 47 billion last year, which is up 12% of the previous year. It's around about a 12.5% to 13% penetration of offline sales by online, and spending per capita about 730. So here are the factors. I divide them into kind of push and pull. So what's pushing consumers into shopping online, more so in the UK than elsewhere? Well, okay, economic factors are going to be one factor in this in terms of price, for non-food goods in particular. Accessibility and convenience of the existing offer, which is a point we've already raised. Also, the research tells us that shoppers don't like the same retail environment wherever they go. They like a bit of difference, a bit of creativity. So the sameness of our downtowns, the consumer research starts to say, gets a bit boring for shoppers, and they want a bit of variety and choice. Fear of terrorism is actually a significant element at certain times. Post the Paris attacks, for example. I don't know what you saw in Germany or in the Netherlands, but certainly in the UK, you saw a big hit on London trips and sales as people avoided big cities for about 2 or 3 weeks because of the fear over a repeat attack in those locations.
But I think we have to distinguish now two kinds of customer. For example, okay, there is an existing customer who is familiar with online, with application, and because of terrorism or because of other factors, he would increase his activities to buy online. I get it and I agree. But never ever, I can't imagine that someone who don't know the systems, don't know internet, okay, but internet and Facebook is using by everybody, but because I think there's a psychological barrier to use a credit card on an online.
This is a German issue. Let me show you some German data on that. So Germany, one of the reasons Germany is there is because of historic reluctance to use credit cards for payment.
Okay, let me conclude by saying, would you say and support the statement that, for example, because of terrorism, Charlie Hebdo in Paris, a guy, a woman or a man is starting buying online who never had done it before?
No, I'm not saying that. It could happen, but it's more likely that those people that know how to avoid physical places will do so by shopping more online, rather than necessarily make the switch in channel behaviour. So I'm not saying absolutely that there will be other factors that lack of knowledge, lack of affordability, lack of interest, that will prevent them switching channel. But this factor, I think, does affect those people that do have a choice, and may increase. I think also, though, there are some pull factors. I think what we see in the UK, unlike Finland, for example, is a few large firms who have really made the decision to do something in a non-store way. So whether it's John Lewis, whether it's Tesco, there's a kind of first mover in sectors that has led to others following, and therefore a cumulative effect in the market. Not just existing firms, store-based firms, but of course, if you think about the UK, it tends to be the first target for retailers internationalizing, from the US in particular. So it was one of Amazon's first markets outside the US, for example, other than Canada. And more categories have been developed by Amazon in the UK than anywhere else around the world outside the US. So it's an obvious first port of call for new online businesses as well. And as a result, you get a whole series of cumulative consequences. You get better awareness amongst shoppers. You get more people who are trying this out, who are already online people. You get investment in better fulfillment services. Again, Alma, when you were here 10 years ago, I told the story of an online business selling Christmas trees, which sold 20,000 Christmas trees online before Christmas, but only delivered about 100 of them before Christmas because the fulfillment services were so terrible in the UK at that time. That's really changed. So fulfillment distribution is much better.
Is language a factor?
Language is absolutely a factor. And that's, in some sense, is part of this few large firms thing, because these are often the new startups, the Amazons and so of this world, are essentially English language businesses. We don't yet see Alibaba coming to the UK, but it's around, but actually it's much easier, in principle at least, for an English language firm to come to a UK marketplace initially. Although I do recall that I think it was LL Bean said that they would actually launch in Japan first, because it was the most different market for the one they were operating in. If they could crack it there, then they could do everything in between, But we then, of course, have this kind of cumulative confidence amongst consumers in transaction security, payment with credit cards. Things don't go wrong, therefore that's fine. So reassurance grows. And this cumulative experience of word of mouth that we see is probably also quite important. You get to critical mass, and people talk in the pub to each other, not about their new car, but about the new price comparison service, the new website they've found, and confidence spreads around that way. So what we see here in the UK is kind of internet sales still increasing quite significantly, so above 54 billion forecast for 2016. You also see the store versus online sales trend, and the best place to look at this is probably, there's the online figure, which fluctuates a bit seasonally, but is quite much higher than the store-based growth figure. So that's store sales growth, which is barely off the ground for the last 6 years. And it's just dipped below. December 15, it dipped below zero, whereas online rose a bit. So the gap is opening up between online and store-based sales in the UK. So that's the kind of consequence that we're sort of wrestling with.
Do you have online grocers in
Yeah.
the UK that deliver to your house?
Yeah, well they all do. All the grocers deliver to your house now. The bricks and mortars do it, apart from a couple smaller ones. There is an online-only one called Ocado, which ships John Lewis Waitrose products to the home, and they've never made money. And it's hard to know to what extent multi-channel grocers make money out of the home delivery. All we can say is you'll lose less money by doing click and collect than you will with home delivery. And you have to see, well, actually, do I really want the sale or not? So it's a choice between having the sale at kind of cost or not having the sale.
Dave, do you know Peapod makes a profit?
No, I think they made a marginal profit for the first time in 30 years.
Yeah, Peapods are straight delivered to your house.
That's our hold.
Yeah, and that's been going for quite a while. And Ocado as well has been going for over 10, 12 years and has never made money, despite the fact it's selling probably higher margin grocery product than most of the retailers. And that suggests to me that very few other kind of established grocery businesses are making money from home delivery.
Brick and mortar barely do it, in the US.
Yeah.
Well, collectively in the UK, I saw a figure about a year old that the major chains were losing £300 million on that activity. So, I mean, how long can that go on for?
Yeah, so in fact there's already been, as you know, the UK market will know there's been a kind of pulling back from some of this and move towards persuading people through price to go to click and collect rather than to home delivery and charging for home delivery at significant points. So John Lewis again has, I think, broke ranks and kind of charging for non-food at one point last year. So there are going to have to be some changes to the system.
They've been really pushing the format of click and collect, don't they? Without areas in the car parks that you can drive. Yeah, that's right.
Tried it, but I don't think it's really taken off.
Yeah, but if you look at France, for example, Le Drive, which is the drive-through dark store formats, must be getting on for I think 2,500 of those around France now. All the major grocery chains are using those. It's not clear to me whether those are profitable ventures or not, or whether it's simply taking sales or otherwise have gone to their competitors.
I saw the sign on the boots here in Oxford.
Yeah. Did you take advantage of it?
Yeah. Took a picture.
Yeah. Well, here's the US comparison, and David may want to kind of comment a bit on this. But in the US, we've got 50% growth in e-commerce, third quarter of last year compared to third quarter of the previous year. Similar kinds of movement in terms of percentage change, averaging out about 15% a year for the last 5 years. But it does vary by sector, So if you look at total retail sales, it's been pretty kind of awful across the piece. Look at
the US is about 7% versus, as Jonathan said, between 12 and 13% in the UK.
Non-store has been moving faster. But within the non-store category as well, you've got some big differences, I think. And David, you might want to comment.
Well, this is the
comment
old
on
direct
this.
mail catalogue shopping, which is now heavily converted to the internet. And the Census Bureau, which puts these figures together in the States, calls it the non-store category. And all that really shows you that how important clothing and accessories are as part of total non-store sales. And how insignificant the entire food and beverage business is in the non-store space in the United States. It's just over 2% of total non-store sales. It's really tiny in terms of the total grocery market.
But does this again, this comes back to measurement, doesn't it? So to what extent does this include kind of what you call mixed retail businesses that cut across channels? Or is this pure non-store?
Yeah, this is the share of non-store only. And so the share of total retail that food through the internet is really tiny. It's 1-2%.
Why do you think it's just 2.3%? What is it cost by?
Just because it includes beverages. You can't drink a pint of beer on the internet. It's definitional, but the convenience of the facilities in the US for selling food and beverages is so great. The parking is so easy. Not as many traffic wardens. All sorts of factors.
We don't even have to worry about it.
That's right.
Parking lot.
That's right. And yet you compare it to this is the Chinese situation. So we have, despite the fact that we've got some difficulties in China with the downturn of consumer sales, we have almost a kind of a leapfrogging effect going on here with businesses going straight to mobile rather than actually bother to build stores in the conventional way. And the number of online shoppers, the value of those transactions, the proportion of online sales in total retail, the forecast for that, it's going to eclipse Western markets significantly over the next 2 or 3 years, and in 1 or 2 cases already has, with a few very large players like Tmall, JD, and Suning, and so on. So this is a very different kind of market, and one where, again, we think, as we will with David, about some of the location planning implications of this. How do we forecast demand? How do we provide fulfillment in these kinds of fast-growing markets? And add to that, the digital influence piece.
Could you say that China is template for the future markets all around the world? Because they're the stores, and they are switching to internet, and in other parts of countries, younger generations are probably leaning more on online.
And there's one hypothesis, and we talk about scenarios tomorrow, but one scenario that suggests that could be the case. The challenge with that, of course, is that you have a lot of existing investment in Western markets, you have a lot of existing behaviours in Western markets, and stores do play a role. What's become very clear is that this is no longer quite as easy to argue what you call a substitution case, that everything will be replaced by online. I think it's the fact that Amazon is opening a couple of stores. It's clear that stores play a complementary role. The challenge is working out how to make that complementary role profitable when you've got the same number of customers, but you're increasing your costs overall to meet the same demand in some respects. In China, you've got less of a legacy infrastructure to stop you from doing that. If you look at the US or Europe, you've got a massive infrastructure that needs to be addressed in terms of its performance.
I think in the US, a lot of people use online to find the price.
Yeah.
And then they go to the store.
Well,
I know for electronics that's true.
this is the point here.
You want to hold it, the camera, whatever.
This is absolutely the point here. So this is about these multiple touch points we keep hearing about, about the customer's journey through the shopping process, and at what point you need a store, at what point you want online, at what point you want a phone or whatever. And the UK data suggests we're talking about 54 billion next year or this year in terms of online sales, up from 47 last year. But the amount influenced by digital is about 170 billion. that is to say influence in terms of the fact that you've looked up online before you go to the store, or you've used the digital channel in some way during the purchase process. And mobile increasingly powerful, particularly of course the electronics, particularly in, home furnishings, home improvement, as a kind of preparatory research before shopping commitment. And in the US, it doesn't look quite the same because the infographic is slightly different here, but we're looking probably at influence by digital, around about 49% of sales, worth $1.7 trillion in terms of value.
Sorry. What's the differences between digital and mobile?
So that what they've done is they've just taken mobile out of this piece here. So actually, it's 57% digital, of which 32 is so you just looked at, if you took out non-mobile, it would be that piece there. Okay.
Like
So in other words, we're saying that mobile is actually over half the digital influence.
computer versus
Yeah.
phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah. So all they've done is just it's badly displayed. All they've done is to take they've just taken the mobile bit out and expressed it as a separate percentage. Yeah. Sorry, that wasn't clear. I'll have a word with Deloitte later about that. And they've done it separately here actually, so you can see it here. So electronics 62%, mobile 37%, not dissimilar actually for the US. So what that means is, and I'm going to be handing over to David in just a few minutes to talk about the implications for location planning, is that we're kind of adjusting to the new normal. I've already kind of alluded to many of these kinds of issues. What does this new normal mean? Well, Barclays talking about this last year. It means for them fiscal prudence by shoppers, a desire to balance the budget both amongst shoppers and retailers, and an ongoing search for value will remain a feature of the shopping landscape despite the fact that we're in kind of slow growth and slow recovery at the moment. And for retailers, that means, as we've described, increased costs across channels. It means lower productivity because people are just browsing in your stores rather than buying. So unless you have a good way of converting the value of those sales and attributing them to the store because people are in that store, then you've got a problem because you can't join the two parts of your business. And tomorrow afternoon we're hearing about this mobile data piece, which does offer the opportunity to link the kind of browsing and conversion aspects of consumer behavior. Any surplus that many companies make is driven into driving down price through promotion and price offers in a low inflationary, low growth environment, and margins go down as a consequence. That's a fairly gloomy kind of story to paint. And if we look at the UK in particular, what you find, certainly when we looked at this over the last few years, chain expansion at an all-time low, apart from selected areas of growth. It's all, as Todd says, focusing on more intensive, profitable use of the existing space. And we can certainly see store closures growing rapidly in number in certain locations, and David's got some data on the US to share with us on that. So what do you do with these kinds of things? This is the Tesco footprint, something like 17 million square feet of hypermarket space, a lot of which is devoted to non-food. What do you do with that spare space? Because it's non-food in these kinds of locations that is most under threat from the online competitive offer in many respects. So reconfiguring that infrastructure, and this is the extreme end, if you like, of that, is going to be very, very challenging. And you can already see the kind of decline in supermarket pipelines here. We can already see I talked about apparel retailing outlets, the kind of decline in women's clothing shops and chains, particularly multiples, over a 2-year period, 5% fall amongst multiple non-food retailers over a 2-year period in the UK, and the mix is changing in high streets. We can see it in shopping malls as well. So again, UK data, but you can see that in other markets too, in the West particularly, the fall away of growth in shopping centres. We have one big shopping centre development going on here in Oxford, the Westgate redevelopment. I was a student here in the 1970s when that was first being talked about. They're finally getting around to doing it. 40 years later, okay, it's taken. So that just shows how difficult it is to do big developments in UK historic towns. But it also shows how rare increasingly these developments are at the moment. You went to see Westfield, I think. Who went to see Westfield? Yes, we went to Westfield yesterday. And, that's one of the last big developments of its kind in the UK recently. And what's happening is that these prime assets are scarce, hence leading to the kind of things David talked about, which was this greater utilisation of shopping centre space because there's less of it. And you see polarisation of risk. So you see certain malls in off-centre locations or in centres, as we'll hear from Alex Singleton later on today, which are less resilient to the impact of e-business and e-commerce being at risk, whereas places like Westfield, and indeed Westgate in Oxford potentially, will be seen as low-risk locations for physical retailing. And nearly every mall in the country, at the moment, certainly either has been or is about to be refurbished as a consequence of this reinvestment in the existing real estate rather than building lots of new stuff. So I'm going to, pass on to David in a few moments, but a final point on costs. And what we do know about constructing this omni-channel infrastructure, moving away from stores, is its expense in general terms. But we also know that actually it's not necessarily going to deliver the same kind of profits that the previous store-based infrastructure did. Many UK retailers talked about resetting the profit button, resetting the level of profits for investors, because it means almost re-engineering the nature of the business in going forward. And here's our kind of take on this, and this is arguable depending on the sector that you're in, but it's not just about an increase in costs. We think it's about some costs that are increasing, some costs that are staying about the same, and some costs that are actually decreasing in one or two instances. And for each business in each sector, these trade-offs are going to be a little different. So, in terms of percent of sales, increasing costs are going to be from IT, of course, replacing and integrating legacy systems. And I think on my next slide, where are we there? We've got John Lewis increasing its IT capital spend from 15% of all capital spend to 37% of all capital spend over the next 4 years. It's about increased distribution costs, moving from a kind of last mile model to the retail delivering. And we know that it'll be pulled back from home delivery to click and collect. That'll still be more expensive in many instances than store-based delivery. Inventory costs as well. And so I think with inventory we're going to see, because of economic reasons and because of commodity prices and so on and shipping costs, we're going to see sourcing shifting as well, which may affect some of the pricing of non-food goods in particular in an undesirable direction. Now we're saying no change to labour costs. In fact, the reason we say that is because we see that there'll be some decreases in labour costs linked to exiting number of store locations and taking out store-level personnel, but that'll be offset by growth in high-cost specialist functions, particularly around IT, particularly around analytics, roles such as yours. Because we see a big growth in analytics functions across businesses as retail organisations seek to better understand where the contribution is coming from across channels. Now in the UK this has been rather affected by the growth of the living wage impact on businesses, and there's just been a major report done by the British Retail Consortium on productivity in UK retailing, which talks about fewer jobs but better in retailing. Possibly 1 million jobs out of 3 million jobs going in the next 5 years in the UK retail sector. So retailing in the UK employs about 2.9 million people. A third of those could vanish in the next 5 years as the sector restructures. And that's a big number, and I don't think the UK is alone in having to face that kind of restructuring in the longer term.
I think online is a game of waiting for your competitor to go bankrupt.
Yeah. So the trick is, as long as you're running faster than the guy behind you, the bear will get them rather than you. So it's last person standing, in these markets. So if you look at in the UK electrical retailing, Carphone Dixon's Carphone, it has been has actually been quite a successful business, but it's the last big physical electrical retailer kind of trading outside the department store sector, the specialty store. But we do have some decreasing costs. We have some decreasing costs in terms of store property as retailers optimize their portfolios, but there'll be some exit costs to doing that. Exit costs in terms of redundancy payments, exit costs in terms of buying out leases, and so on. And then there'll be some decreasing marketing costs, potentially, as spend moves across to more cost-effective channels to reach consumers. Although even that is a little uncertain, because how effective are some of those new channels at reaching individuals? Pepsi moved all its spending from conventional promotional sources to online and social media for the Super Bowl last year, and it was a disaster. Sales fell. So there are some really unpredictable consequences for some of this shift. So the final thing I'm going to show you before handing over to David is this slide. I'm glad he's walked into the room. That's good. Welcome back. That's right. Nicely timed. This is a piece of work done by McKinsey. And again, it's a general piece looking at a general US retailer for a US retail company. And what it does here is assume a 5% decline in sales per square foot over 5 years, which is not an unreasonable kind of estimate. And what it says is, well, here's the starting point. Earnings before interest and taxes, return on invested capital, those figures. What it suggests, if you do nothing, given projected online and space trends, then your earnings before interest and taxes fall by nearly a third. And your return on invested capital falls by a third over that period. Whereas if you optimize your operations, you can reduce some of that hemorrhage a bit, but you can't eliminate it. So whatever you do, even if you do it really, really well, you're still going to end up with a different trade-off in terms of your earnings potential and your return on invested capital. And I'd urge you, if you're interested, to take a look at this. It's free to air on McKinsey Quarterly's website. There's a bit more nuanced analysis of that. So this suggests we're in a game which is about juggling our scarce assets, making them work harder for us. We're in a game about running faster than the competition to keep ahead of the online gorilla in the corner. No longer in the corner, it's sort of stomping towards us. Being very, very good with the numbers, very, very analytical. And again, I think this favours the profession in the room, location planning and analysis as a technique. So I'm going to pass on to David here, and we're 25 past 11. I think we'll probably go till about 12 o'clock on this piece, before we take a short break for Alex Singleton to talk to us. But David's going to take up the story and continue with, if you like, the implications for location analysis research.